In 2020, Hixson retired as distinguished professor at the University of Akron. He's a columnist and contributing editor of the magazine Washington Report and on Middle East affairs. And there's so much more that I could have added to this bio. At this point, I would like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Walter Hixson. Walter?
Thank you, Janet. And it's great to be with you all. Thanks to Middle East Peace Now and also JVP, which I'm very familiar and really laud the work that both of your groups are doing, and it's so important to act out on a local and regional level. I have a Minneapolis connection. My sister lives there, and another book that I did, a little book, was on famous Minnesotan Charles Lindbergh. So I've knocked around in the Minnesota area a few times. Questions and answers, I hope. I think in advance. Centers around my new book, which is coming out April 7th. And that'll be my 11th book, the first one that'll be an audio book as well as a text format. So I'm looking forward to that. So it's
Seems like we're having an issue with your video, Dr. Hixson. It's freezing up for me, and I think for some other people as well. I'm not sure if you can hear me at the moment. Okay, and just as we have so many more possibilities available with Zoom, we also have some challenges as well. So we will work to get Dr. Hixson back online as soon as we are able to.
good on.
We can hear you a little bit, but you were cutting out some. Okay. Your video is freezing up a little bit there, Dr. Hixson.
Hello.
Hello? Could you try just speaking without the video
I'm here.
on? Sometimes video slows down the connection.
Hello. That help at all?
Yes, I can hear you just fine, and no video. Okay.
Want me to continue or what?
Maybe continue just speaking for a little bit, and then we can try switching video back on. Hopefully connection will be good at that point.
All right, you'd like me to continue with the presentation?
Yes, please.
You hear me?
Yep, I can hear you
Okay.
just fine. Sometimes the video feed slows down overall connection.
Yeah, I've done a lot of Zooms and haven't had trouble from my end, but I can hear you just fine. I don't know what's going on, but yeah, I'll keep going. You guys can probably live without looking at me. I was saying that the structure of the talk is around my new book, which is entitled Architects of Repression: How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of U.S. Middle East Policy. It's coming out on April 7th. Just check Amazon if you're interested. And I was mentioning the blurbs I got, and one that I think summed up the book's contribution nicely from Ilan Pappé, who of course is the author of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Are you hearing me all right?
Yes,
Eddie?
perfectly.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, very good. This very generous blurb, Pape writes, if you ever wondered what the USA role in the ongoing Nakba of the Palestinian people is, you need to read this book. If you ever wondered how the Israel lobby in the USA corrupted the American foreign policy towards Palestine and beyond, you need to read this book. This book analyzes in a clear narration based on solid analysis and documentation how this corrupted and vicious American policy culminated in the Trumpian era. This book points clearly to all the culprits who bred racism, violence, and injustice in the USA and inflicted this unholy trinity on Palestine and its people. So a really nice blurb, but sums up also the book's argument. I propose to read a few paragraphs from it and then talk more informally about the book and then turn it over to all of you for questions and answers. So Architects of Repression offers a comprehensive, up-to-date, and evidence-driven historical assessment of the role of the Israel lobby in US politics and foreign policy since World War II. So this is a comprehensive history to the present since World War II. The book puts to rest any doubt as to whether the lobby has played and continues to play a crucial role in enabling Israeli aggression, the suppression of Palestinian rights, and the failure to achieve a comprehensive Middle East peace accord. Rooted in archival evidence and an abundant secondary literature, a lot of research went into this book. It shows how the lobby works by deploying propaganda, targeting campaign contributions, organizing demonstrations, and exerting political pressure to manage public opinion, and especially to influence the Congress. Architects of Repression thus lays bare the ways and means by which a critical branch at the epicenter of the United States government and in control of the purse strings became heavily influenced by a lobby representing the interests of a foreign country. The massive largesse that the United States has provided Israel, far more than allocated to any other country, and dispersed on favorable terms reserved for Israel alone, is only one of many enabling benefits the small Zionist state has received over many decades from the most powerful nation in the world. While the Zionist movement long preceded the creation of Israel, this book homes in on the period since World War II, not on the formative years of Zionist advocacy. The full-blown lobby was forged in the early 1940s and has grown explosively to the present day. That eight-decade period is the focus of the book. I also provide an appendix that's a critical analysis of the biblical narrative and of the arc of Jewish history. So I did research into ancient history as well and placed it in an appendix. I don't compare the Israel lobby to other lobbies. I don't focus on Western Europe and the UK. What the book does really home in on is the United States and the actions of the lobby in the United States. So what the book shows is that for decades, the lobby played a pivotal role as the United States enabled all of the following: Israel's disdain for a negotiated settlement of the Middle East conflict. This is an important point, to say the least. Israel has been the main obstacle to a Middle East peace, period. The evidence makes this extremely clear-cut. It's contemptuous dismissal of the plight of Palestinian refugees. Throughout this history, just utter disdain for these refugees, 750,000 at the start, millions today. Pivotal role enabling all of the following includes also its cultivation of nuclear weapons in defiance of the global nuclear non-proliferation movement. And we can get into the contemporary issue with Iran if you wish, but it's highly notable that it is Israel that introduced and did so in a mendacious way with its special ally, the United States, lying about it all the way. But it's Israel that introduced nuclear weapons to the Middle East. Finally, it's palpably racist, illegal, and destabilizing Jewish-only settlements, including the takeover of Jerusalem as well, much of the West Bank and the Golan Heights, and its ongoing violent aggression, which has victimized Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as neighboring states, notably Lebanon. So all of this is dealt with in the book. It's a pretty comprehensive, yet pretty concise history. In more recent years, we can talk about this more in the Q&A if you wish as well, the Israel lobbies launched a campaign to criminalize political engagement and freedom of speech by equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Not content to repress Palestinian rights, the lobby now seeks to take them away from their fellow Americans. The concluding paragraph of the book I'll share with you, and then I'll flesh out some more details from it, and then we can discuss it further any direction you want to go. Here's the last paragraph of the book. The dramatic changes that are required in Middle East politics depend to a great extent on Americans coming to grips with the irrefutable facts of Israeli racial repression and the lobby's distortions and assaults on free thought and free speech. Once a critical mass of Americans understands that they are financing racial repression and aggression, Israel and its lobby will be called to account. At a minimum, the United States should make all future financial assistance and political support of Israel dependent upon a just solution in Palestine. In order to make this approach a reality, the lobby's grip on Congress must be publicized, condemned, and broken. The liberation of Palestine and of Americans from an oppressive lobby is on the agenda of humanity. So that's a few paragraphs from the book, and we can come back to any of that you want to. Let me just flesh out, using the subtitle, some more information and arguments and evidence and overview of what Architects of Repression and the research I've done on the lobby reveals. So that's the title, Architects of Repression, How Israel and Its Lobby, and we can talk more if you want about what comprises the lobby. It's mainly AIPAC, and the book centers on AIPAC, but it's not AIPAC alone. There are literally countless, hundreds of Israel affinity organizations. There is a very high level coordinating group called the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, which works closely with AIPAC. But there are many, many groups. I use a small L for the lobby because it's not one entity. But it is important to understand that this is the most powerful lobby in the entire history of the United States in terms of representing a foreign country. There's never been a lobby, China lobby, Irish, Cuban, have all been influential, but there's never been a lobby, nothing like the influence of the Israel lobby on American foreign policy and on the Congress. So it's not, as many Americans are led to believe, the behemoths, Russia and China, that command influence over American politics. It is the little country of 9 million people, Israel, that has by far and away, through its actions in coordination with its lobby, over American politics and foreign policy. It's sweeping and not matched by any other lobby. Even beyond just foreign lobbies, the Israel lobby is typically mentioned in the same breath as the gun, pharmaceutical, and elderly persons lobby in terms of lobbies, period, and their influence on American politics. So AIPAC is a behemoth. It has a multi-story headquarters in Washington. It's employing as many as 500 people. It has a $6 billion plus fundraising. It's not able to spend all of that on lobbying, but it takes far more money to have an organization than you can actually put into pockets in campaigns, but that's substantial as well. So we're dealing with, a very major lobby that has gone to some extent because of its own propaganda work under the radar in American history. So all that's brought out in the book. The subtitle, How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of Middle East Policy. Let's break that down a little bit. So, and this is one of the most important sort of tactical approaches I think can be taken these days, particularly in the wake of, as you all know all about in Minneapolis, the George Floyd incident and the Black Lives Matter movement. Israel's a racist country. It's that simple and that stark, and it's not remotely debatable. It's a country rooted in ethnic and racial discrimination. So Israel's often described as the only democracy in the Middle East, and it's become, with each passing day, including these elections going on right now, where far-right parties are basically have been compared to the KKK, are gaining seats and allying with Netanyahu to form a new government. So it's more right-wing and racially repressive. And of course, Netanyahu himself has been blatantly racist on a number of occasions. And Bernie Sanders said it best when he called out Netanyahu as a racist and was not afraid to use the term. And so this man's been elected 4 or 5 times, about to get another term, perhaps. And so they have to own their racism. But not only is it racist, well, let's take this from the beginning. The Zionist thrust of Zionism from the very early period, dating back to World War I and really taking off in World War II, it's a settler colonial project. So this is something I've worked on and is a scholarly paradigm that we can talk about more if you want to hear more about it. I think it is very important to help understand Israel, to understand it's a settler colonial society. And so was the United States. And I'm speaking from formerly inhabited Delaware, Indian land in Ohio, and you have I'm not sure, I don't recall, Sioux, Chippewa, Ojibwa up there in Minneapolis. We're settler colonial society, and what they do is they move indigenous people off the land and take it for themselves. That's the essence of what settler societies do. The United States is one, Israel is one, Australia, South Africa, there are others, many others, Argentina. And so what settlers do is displace the indigenous population and claim it as a sacred homeland of their own. And that's what the history of Israel is all about. And it's what the history of the United States is all about. It's one reason they get along so well, because both are settler societies rooted in racial oppression and violence. Doesn't make them, necessarily uniquely evil in the world. There's lots of racial oppression and violence. But what's important about Israel's is the timing of it. It makes Israel a particularly reactionary state. That is to say, it's one thing to do it in the 19th century, American Manifest Destiny, and earlier. It's another thing to do it in the wake of the Nazi genocide, the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, the rights of indigenous people, the decolonization, modern civil rights movements. It makes Israel a particularly reactionary, racist society. So from initial goal that David Ben-Gurion and others spelled out very clearly, he said this very clearly and blatantly: we must remove Arabs and take their places. That's a virtual direct quote. We must remove Arabs and take their places. So ethnic cleansing, Nakba, this was the Zionist agenda, and it was carried out in 1948. It was accelerated in 1967 in a war which Israel launched, the June 1967 war. This has also been misrepresented often. This is a war of aggression by Israel in 1967. The United States, the UN, the Arabs, all wanted to avoid a war in 1967. The country that wanted a war and had one was Israel, because it was militarily superior and could do what it did, which is take the West Bank, the Golan Heights, Gaza, and Sinai in that war. So Israel has been very aggressive and very assertive, and the racist part has really culminated here. So it's a state, as I'm sure you probably know, that has about 20% Palestinian population within Israel. That is, so when it's described as a democracy, there's some truth to that. The Palestinians have the right to vote, but they are severely politically and socially marginalized and demonized as well. And there are all sorts of aspects to this, whether it's marriage laws or, while any Jew in the world can migrate to Israel, you can't marry if you're an Israeli and make an Israeli citizen. Anyone from Iran, Lebanon, Syria, so-called enemy states. There are others. So there are all kinds of exclusive laws. You can keep Palestinians out of your settlements that are Jewish only. It's very easy to do that, and it's done. But within Israel itself, 20% of the Palestinian of the population is Palestinian. They do have voting rights, but their political power is very much curbed, and there's never been a desire to have them as equal citizens, and there's been much effort to prevent them from doing it. It's much worse in the West Bank and Golan Heights, where these are occupied territories that have been settled. Jewish-only settlements have proliferated over 750,000, something like that now. Settlers, all illegal, all on illegally occupied territory, all in violation of international law. So these are not even marginalized citizens, these are colonized people. And I'm sure some of the listeners have have taken a tour with Eyewitness Palestine or some other group. If you haven't, it's eye-opening, to say the least. And the occupation and the colonialism and the repression is palpable and quite impossible to avoid. So this is a repressive colonial environment outside of Israel's boundaries, a marginalization at best within. Finally, to culminate the racial aspect of this, in 2018, Israel, Gideon Levy described this as a truthful law. Israel came clean with the nation state law in 2018, which basically says Israel is a Jewish state, Hebrew is the official language, and it instantly marginalized that Palestinian population, as well as Ethiopian migrants, Druze, and other groups. So Israel is a repressive, racist society. So again, I'm fleshing out the subtitle. I'll go a couple more minutes and then we can turn it over for questions and answers. The subtitle is of Architects of Repression is How Israel and Its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of US Middle East Policy. Let's talk about the violence. It's been persistent. Israel is a small, heavily militarized state. That's your tax dollars at work, billions of them. So I don't think I've said, I'm sure most of you know, Israel has received more foreign assistance. It overwhelmingly goes to military assistance from the United States than the United States has provided to any other country in the world. Just think about that. Here's a small country of 9 million people in the Middle East that doesn't, have oil pumping into the American economy or something horribly valuable that the United States must have and fund the military to get. It's more a cultural attachment, which we can talk about more, and of course the actions of the lobby. But here's the small little country that has received and regularly receives on terms that are not provided to any other country in the world. That is, other countries we don't aid in the same way. Israel gets the money in advance, so it can begin to use it and collect on it before an arrangement unique to it alone, the way the money is even given out. And in addition, it's more than any other country in global history has ever received from the United States. So this is deeply problematic from just the standpoint of American taxpayers and where their money is going, and it's going to a repressive and violent apartheid regime. And by the way, you can see in the chat, I think that Maddie has put it in the chat, a conference we're organizing together with the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs and the Institute for Research Middle East Policy, which is the publisher of my book and is the think tank run by Grant Smith, which does and has done for years marvelous work, as has the Washington Report. These are two tremendous sources, along with Monda Weiss, Electric Intifada, and others I'm sure you're familiar with. JVP is great on all of these realities of the Middle East. So, we're building off of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem's recent declaration that, in fact, Israel is an apartheid state. And it's pretty hard to avoid that conclusion after the nation state law. But for the Israeli human rights group to come out and say it is important, and we're building on that in a conference that is timed with the J Street meeting. And if we can also talk about the problems of so-called liberal Zionism and the limitations of that in contrast to JVP, which is a real progressive anti-apartheid organization. J Street is not. We can come back to that if you want. The violence permeates this history, and it's not all Israeli violence. We know about, of course, much famed suicide bombers and so-called terror attacks. And of course, when you're killing innocent people, I think it's fair to call it a terror attack, and it's deeply unfortunate. There's no doubt about that this situation has inspired terror attacks. And so Israel doesn't have a monopoly on the violence in the Middle East conflict, but in fact, it has been the main initiator. And it's conducted myriad massacres in conflicts throughout the history of Zionist movement. So it's been the overwhelming perpetrator of violence and typically the initiator of it. And this is not something I knew about when I began to look into this. In fact, most of my work as a historian was on the history of the Cold War. That's what I worked on throughout the 1980s and 90s. It's really been just in this century that, and particularly in the last 10 or 12 years, and particularly after a trip I took in 2013 with Eyewitness Palestine and saw the occupation, that I've worked on this. So I went back and read the history, and I was just astonished that I didn't know the depth of it, and how aggressive Israel was, beginning with the Nakba, beginning with the displacement of 750,000 people, the assassination of the UN mediator in 1948 sent over to try to mediate the conflict, the utter disdain for diplomacy with regard to refugees, with regard to the status of Jerusalem, with regard to the UN. This is one of the great tragedies of the American-Israeli special relationship, how it's perverted the UN. The United States was primarily responsible for creating the UN. And this international agency headquartered in New York did wonderful things like the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, like the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Once it recognized the partition of Palestine, once Israel gained UN recognition in 1948, from that moment on, it has had utter disdain for the UN, and the United States has supported it right down the line. a few censures, a few negative votes, but very often the United States joins with, the Marshall Islands alone, which is an American colony, to vote against overwhelming UN condemnations of illegal settlement, illegal occupation, etc. So this is another undertold story, the perversion of the UN in the context of this conflict. But after the original violence in 1948, the part that I didn't know about at all, and ironically, a Zionist apologist today, Benny Morris, wrote a really good book before he became such a total sellout as a historian on the Israel's borderland conflicts. And they attacked wantonly across the borders into Jordan and into Syria, especially Jordan with the long border. The Kibbya Massacre in 1953 is a famous incident. That's Q-I-B-Y-A if you're not familiar with it. Look that up. That was Ariel Sharon, who's a war criminal and an Israeli prime minister and defense minister. So it's a country that's had terrorist leaders. Menachem Begin was a terrorist. Yitzhak Shamir was a terrorist. They killed innocent people in British Palestine. If you're going to define Hamas as terrorists, you've got to define Menachem Begin and Irgun and Lehi as terrorists. You can't have it both ways. But of course, the lobby and Israel do like to do that. So initiated the 1956 Sinai War along with Britain and France, initiated the 1967 war, as I mentioned. And the USS Liberty was sunk during that war. If you want to ask about that, you can as well. Did not initiate the 1973 war, but escalated it and defied a ceasefire. Invaded Lebanon. What Israel has done to Lebanon on multiple occasions is beyond criminal aggression. Wanton massacres. And the United States got caught up in these in the 1980s, sending Marines to be sitting ducks to blow back attacks in Lebanon. So Gaza in this century, horrific violence directed at Gaza in 2009 and 2014. Look, this is a militaristic, violent state that justifies aggression, wanton aggression, massacres. The gap between Israeli casualties and those of its victims is massive in all these conflicts that I've mentioned. So when you really look at, this lobby depiction of the sole democracy in the Middle East, it's really belied by the history and by the evidence of Israel, in fact, being a violent, racist society. I mean, it's a nice, those of you who have been there, Europeanized sort of place. It's a very pleasant place if you're Jewish and live in, Tel Aviv or comfortable environments, Haifa, whatever it might be. It's a horrific place if you live in Gaza or the occupied territories. Finally, injustice. I was going to talk with that about the UN. I've already discussed this. I think one of the more important and neglected parts, as I've already mentioned, has been the blows to international justice that this special relationship helping this militarized aggressor to carry out. The other aspect of the injustice, which is really blowing back now on the American homeland, where we've been a homeland since 2001. I still don't like this reference personally, but blowing back on the United States, this attack on free speech now. Of course, maybe it's with the attack on voting rights going on, maybe this sort of new neo-fascism, neo-authoritarianism is where we're heading if we don't stop it. But basically what Israel and the lobby are doing now is trying to equate any criticism of Israel with delegitimization of Israel and equate that with anti-Semitism and basically bar free speech. So this is an attack on American freedom of speech, American constitutional rights. It's blowing back into the United States. You know, college students have been horribly mistreated. Students for Justice in Palestine, there are many cases I write about in the book, and other groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights and Palestine Legal carefully track all this. You can have a group on campus that meets to criticize Israeli actions, and they'll label it hostile speech and anti-Semitism. People will write letters to the president of the university, the board of trustees, the lobby, local lobby will get to work. They'll bring pressure to bear. The universities will then turn against their own students taking the initiative to speak freely and understand world affairs, and they'll repress them when they can. So it's really odious. All kinds of ridiculous laws have been proposed to strike down free speech and equate any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which is absurd. In fact, it's an insult to the real anti-Semitism that does go on and leads to violent attacks in this country. Instead, this is the focus of Israel in the lobby. Finally, I'll say just a couple of words here about generalized Middle East policy of the United States. And I'm sure I've discussed a lot very quickly, and you'll have questions. US Middle East policy since World War II has been a disaster. And the special relationship with Israel is at the center of it. It's not the sole cause of it. Certainly, the support for these oil-drenched, repressive, authoritarian monarchies, where today you have a leader of Saudi Arabia who can murder a journalist, and we're basically okay with it. Keep that oil coming. This has been the approach to post-World War II US foreign policy in the Middle East, to side with these reactionary monarchies, to side with Zionist reactionaries, and to destabilize the whole region to the immiseration of the bulk of its population, and then to express shock when people become angry and violent and have intifadas and strap bombs to their bodies. So that's been the history of it. I think it's been as disastrous, fully as disastrous as the Indochina War, the Vietnam War, and not fully recognized as such, although there is some devastating good work on it by Andrew Bacevich and many other people. So it is understood that these forever wars, but even Bacevich and others, they steer clear of the Zionist part of this, and it is a big part of it. It's certainly not the only part. The support for the Arab monarchies and their repressive policies has been also a major part of it. But just in conclusion, I think that US Middle East policy is desperately in need of reform, along with the relationship with Israel and the Arab world. So with that, I think I'll stop. Gives a good half hour. I can't see you all. I might try the video again, or do you want me to just stay this way? But I'm ready to turn it over to questions.
Thanks so much. You covered a lot of really important topics and brought them together so well. So I'm thankful for that, and I'm sure others are as well. If you would like to start, try the video again, I think that would be okay. Otherwise, we
give
can
it a
leave it
shot.
as is.
Okay, there I am.
There we go. Okay, I've got wonderful questions here. And let's see. I'll try to organize them in somewhat of a cohesive way. But to start out, do you have any comments about the film, The Occupation of the American Mind, Israeli Public Relations War in the USA, and what is your opinion of it?
It's a great film. It's a really very highly revealing film. If you haven't seen it, get it, watch it. It's very good on how the lobby just relentlessly manages public opinion, puts out these talking points about Israel's right to defend itself when it was just, indiscriminately bombing Gaza and literally massacring unarmed people. And, the Obama liberal, quote unquote, Obama administration was totally hamstrung, could not do anything amidst this 51-day bombardment of Gaza. And so the film doesn't focus exclusively on that, but it does does a great job of showing the power of the lobby. So Sid Jelly did a really tremendous job with that film. I highly recommend it. Another film, by the way, on the lobby is called, what is it? The Lords of, well, now I've forgotten the name, but there's another recent book by an Israeli filmmaker out on AIPAC, and it's quite good, but not as good as Sid Jolly's film, Occupation of the American Mind. So it's a very good film.
Thank you. We'll send that, I put that link in the chat, and I'll also send it out in the follow-up email. So is there any evidence that the Israel lobby is beginning to lose some of its power, especially with young people?
Yes, I think there is, and that they face real challenges. They're incredibly powerful, incredibly resilient, incredibly determined. Just as in terms of effectiveness alone, I have a great deal of respect for the Israel lobby. What they've done has been amazing since the 1940s to build such a powerful and effective lobby that polices discourse as shown in the Occupation of the American Mind. It's truly from a pure lobbying standpoint, a tremendous accomplishment. But they face real problems. They call it the delegitimization of Israel but the criticism, they've really, particularly with the nation state law, really made their own bed now. And this is not the lobby, this is Israel, and many pro-Israeli groups like J Street were very opposed to the nation state law, which makes Israel an apartheid state. So really, if we as activists want to do something about it, homing in on this apartheid status, which is irrefutable and part of Israeli state law now, part of their constitutional makeup, this makes them very vulnerable, I think. And so I think you mentioned young people, millennials and younger people, they're not, I hope, going to tolerate racial oppression and apartheid. And so it's a matter of communicating the message that, hey, did you know we're giving more money to this country, billions of dollars annually, automatic, doled out 3.8 like clockwork, billion every year. And they're an apartheid state and they violently repress people and they shoot them dead if they protest. Is that where you want your tax money to go? So I think if we make this point, and there are groups like your group, like JVP, like all the groups, that work against this, that continue their efforts. It's very difficult work, and you're up against tremendous power and money, and it's going to take time, but things do change. And we've seen sudden events historically, like the collapse of the Soviet Empire, like the collapse of apartheid, like rights for gay, lesbian, transgender people, etc., that can happen more rapidly sometimes than we expect. And that's the hoped for scenario here. But I do think younger generations will be less tolerant. And the flip side of that is that older, wealthy donors like 87-year-old Sheldon Adelson, who died this year, are going to pass from the scene. Now, here's a guy, a casino mogul, with hundreds of billions of dollars doled out. So generationally, I do think important changes are occurring.
Thank you. I agree. We have somebody who has noticed that you have a Canary Mission profile. So you are targeted by the lobby. Can you talk about this, how this has affected you, and perhaps what students especially can protect themselves from this threat? And then maybe just give an overview of what Canary Mission is to people who may not.
Well, I shouldn't laugh because it's not, I mean, it's in no way serious intellectually, but politically it's a serious. So I'd also like to recommend another film, The Lobby. I think the way to see that is it's a film that's an unofficial film from a mole who went into the lobby movement, and he made a film about it secretly, which is great. If you Google the film the Israel lobby doesn't want you to see, it'll come up, The Lobby USA. And that film depicts this issue. So Canary Mission's founder, Milstein, is presented in the film. It's a very vicious online attack organization, and the lobby has several of these. Camera is a vicious media monitoring group. And yes, I've got a big profile on Canary Mission, although they need to update it. But it didn't affect me at all. Was a tenured distinguished professor, and I wasn't vulnerable. However, I deeply resent what they do to students. So if you're a student who speaks out on this issue, they'll put you on Canary Mission and say you hate Israel and are anti-Semitic and all these other canards. It's just vicious and totally lacking in principle. So it's, if you are targeted, a lot of people have contacted, I guess, somehow Canary Mission and gotten their name off. I would get in touch with the Students for Justice in Palestine or Palestine Legal and see if they can help you if you've been targeted. But it is something that could undermine students' career. Well, we'd like to hire you, but we see you're an anti-Semitic. And so people who are ignorant of the whole situation might be inclined to believe these blatant lies. So it's just a very vicious attack group, which is typical of some of the principleless attacks that the lobby's resorted to.
Thank you. And then a related question, how are you preparing to deal with the kickback to your book from the Israel lobby?
Well, again, I don't have too much to worry about. I'm now retired and, you know, my career is set. You know, I like to think I'm a bold scholar, but if I was on a tenure track program, it would have been very foolish of me to work on anything relating to Israel and the lobby and hope to get tenure at an American university. And that's part of the problem, is that people and university presses, which have to respond to boards of directors and alumni and so forth, they steer clear. I ran into a few things with my book, Israel's Armor. They didn't want me to use the term settler colonialism, which is ridiculous, and didn't want me to use Pape's term ethnic cleansing. Well, when you drive 750,000 people out of their homes because you want to replace them with your ethnic group, I think that's ethnic cleansing. So I've run into a little resistance in university presses, and I'm glad to be publishing this with the Institute of Research Middle East Policy and also getting it out on audio at the same time. So anyway, it's no big deal for me. They can't do much to me and I don't worry about it for me. But they'll either attack it or ignore it. So very revealing in this was the book by Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, the famous book, The Israel Lobby, which my book sort of updates, but does a lot more than they did in terms of some of the research I did into AIPAC archives, notably the Near East Report, the AIPAC newsletter, which I read very carefully and really show how the lobby works. But Mearsheimer and Walt are at Harvard and Chicago. They're extremely prestigious scholars in political science. And there was an all-out campaign against their book, 2007 book, The Israel Lobby. And basically, it left the impression with a lot of people, and this is a very sore point with me, a lot of progressive people also don't get how important the lobby is. And some, including, you know, Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, these are men I tremendously respect for the work they've done. Rashid Halidi, all of them have poo-pooed the significance of the lobby. And frankly, it's because they don't know and haven't done research into how much it does and how central it is. So they went on all-out attack on Walt and Mearsheimer and blunted the impact of that good book. We'll see what happens with mine and others.
Thanks for that. And I just want to take a moment to draw attention to the recent situation of Dr. Cornel West at Harvard and that whole situation with being denied tenure and connections to criticizing Israel and the human rights abuses of Israel and standing up for Palestinian rights. So this is like a very, as you said, it's happening to people.
Yes, it has. And the aforementioned Finkelstein was driven out of DePaul, and there's the Stephen Salaita case. So there have been some important academic cases. I'm not sure about the Cornel West case. I just haven't looked into it yet. I do know Harvard hardly tenures anybody. So keep that in mind too, but I'm not saying it's not a factor. He's certainly radical and radicalism in this country remains problematic, although with Bernie Sanders and others, it's trying to make a comeback. This, I think, is really important also that people haven't realized. The Cold War really, it didn't eradicate the American left, but it buried it. And so unlike Western Europe, we haven't had an active real left. When people say the left, they often mean liberals, and liberals are not, in my view, the left. But so radicals like West do run into problems, yes.
A lot of really great questions coming in as well. What intelligence and data gathering does the lobby do for Israel, and what guidance and funding do they get in return?
Well, they're not going to tell you or me about all of that, but I mean, it's important to understand the Israel lobby is a lobby of Americans. And when it was created in the 1940s, the most largest Jewish population in the world was in the United States. And New York was the center of world Jewry. So the sympathy and the desire to create, which is highly understandable in the wake of the Nazi genocide, that Jewish people would be seeking, refuge and ability to live, and not just the Nazi genocide, but the long history, which I trace in my appendix, of historic anti-Semitism. So this drove the Zionist project in the 1940s. But understand the lobby was American created, but it works very closely with Israel. And so they do collaborate on all these things. And so just as the Pentagon collaborates with Israeli militarists on a variety of actions, some of which we know about, some of which we learn about years and decades later, some of which we may never know about. This is a good question, but I'm afraid I don't have much of an answer for it. Do, however, go to the Institute for Research Middle East Policy site, where Grant Smith has done an extraordinary job of rooting out through Freedom of Information requests and other actions what is available in this regard.
Thank you. I've added that to the list, send in the follow-ups as well. What is your perspective on Christian Zionists in addition to AIPAC? Last year, we learned from a speaker that Christian Zionists now significantly outweigh AIPAC's influence on US policies. Those would be like cookies, for example.
Well, it really depends on how you look at it. I think they are very, very important. And Protestantism from the get-go, from the World War I period, American Protestants have been an important part of the Zionist movement. It's not a new phenomenon. But Christian Zionism and evangelism, evangelicals since the late 70s, the evangelical movement, there was one of these periodic bursts or great awakenings that occur in American history. And they've become a very important part, cultivated, very carefully cultivated by AIPAC. What they have is numbers of largely Republican, largely uncritical, largely evangelical, automatic, don't ask me any questions, automatic pro-Israel support. That's what they represent. On the other hand, they're not big fund donors. These remain wealthy, mostly Orthodox, right-wing Jewish elites who give most of the money to the lobby. So it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about the money, the Christian Zionists are not that important. If you're talking about the overall base, however, that the lobby can build upon and can exert influence in Congress, et cetera, then they're very important and growing. And I even use the term metastasizing force in the Israel lobby. So I think they're very important, but it has to be sort of qualified.
Thank you. I have a couple questions more related to US policy as a whole. Considering, wrong question. Would you say that sanctions are a violent use of US power, especially in relation to sanctions on Iran?
Are a what? Viable?
Are a violent use of US power. So I think this came back, this question was raised during when you were speaking about different forms of violence and power.
Well, I mean, I guess I understand now what you're getting at with that question. So I guess the violence, I mean, they're violent in the sense that they can help undermine life by depriving people of needed sustenance, food, medical equipment, and so forth. So the answer would be yes in that regard. But I'm in favor of sanctions. I want to sanction Israel. So until it ends apartheid regime, allows people to live in their homelands, whether with them or getting out, which I don't think there is any chance of getting out. I think the two-state solution is very much dead. And by the way, which has even disturbed liberal Zionists that Peter Beinart and others have come out and said this. Sanctions, when properly used, are a diplomatic tool. But in reference to Iran and that whole situation, which we might as well use the question to get into a little bit here. This is really tragic what is happening now, potentially tragic, in that Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is by all appearances very pro-Zionist and uncritical of Israel. And rather than doing what they should do, which is immediately go back to the JCPOA, the exceptional international treaty that was negotiated with Iran by Biden's former boss, Obama, which put totally verifiable, utterly foolproof monitoring of Iran. You'd know at the instant they went above certain levels of uranium enrichment. It was one of the great things about the treaty was how verifiable it was. So it was a great treaty. That's why all the major countries of the world, except Israel, signed off on it. And now they're going to cave into the lobby by all appearances and go back to the Trumpian policy, or maintain the Trumpian policy, which of course he shelved the treaty. And this can have horrific consequences, including war, which of course is what Netanyahu and others have wanted with Iran anyway. So this is a very perilous situation right now, and sanctioning Iran, lifting sanctions on Iran in return for a verifiable nuclear treaty was a tremendous accomplishment that only a reckless fool of Trump's caliber could undo. What's sad is to see this moderate Biden administration apparently siding with Donald Trump and Netanyahu.
Thank you. Just a slight follow-up question on that, and you can add any detail or not. How is the lobby sabotaging Biden's campaign to pledge to rejoin the Iran deal? Will the lobby succeed in killing the deal?
So they're succeeding right now. We'll see what happens. Basically it's going to come down to whether Biden and Blinken, and I'm not sure how determined Blinken is at all. But whether Biden is ultimately the commander in chief has to make the decision, wants to uphold a good treaty or cave into Israel and Netanyahu and Trump. What they're doing, among other things, is a tried and true Israel lobby technique. And the book really lays out all of these techniques in detail over the entire history. But what they're doing right now is, well, they have signed, they've had 70 Democrats and 70 Republicans sign a letter insisting now on new conditions for honoring this treaty, which we broke. So we negotiated a treaty with Iran. Iran signed it in good faith. We unilaterally broke it. And now we want to put conditions on them to go back and restart it. And so what AIPAC does, this is what they do and have done for decades. They circulate this letter in Congress and get as many people as they can to sign it. And so they announced a couple of days ago that 70 Republicans and 70 Democrats in the House have signed it. And this is their way of trumpeting bipartisan support for Israel, which is a very real phenomenon and a very real problem. And we probably haven't talked enough about the lobby basically dominating the US Congress. That's the whole key. And this is a good example. So this is a technique they use. You get a letter condemning it, you get people to sign it, that puts them on the record. They fear not signing it, or the lobby will put somebody up to campaign against them, and the lobby will give money to a campaign opponent in the next election. So they sign it even if they're lukewarm on it, even if they know it's wrong. And this is what we really got to do is in groups like local groups with your local politicians, have to confront these people. I really want to would like to see several, particularly, African-American and other proponents of racial equality in this country who yet are totally pro-Israeli apartheid. People like Cory Booker of New Jersey, the Minnesota senator. He's a brilliant and articulate spokesman against, for Black Lives Matter, but he doesn't care for Palestinian lives. They don't matter to him. He's got a very powerful pro-Israeli voting record, and he can be counted on. This is how it works. And so these letters are one way they do this. And there's a letter circulating right now about Iran.
Thank you for that information. I have some follow-up questions to that, but also just want to draw everyone's attention to the chat. I have posted the link for the post-forum survey. So if you just want to take a moment, open it so it's open in your browser as a reminder, and then revisit that after we conclude. Just as a reminder, because we'd really like to hear from you. So here are a couple of questions. How can we encourage our Congress to negate Anti-Bds? And I think this relates to this other question of what needs to happen to increase US support for Palestine politically.
I think one thing that, I sent, in response to your question, mentioned the the Virginia committee that's organized against the Virginia Israel Advisory Group, which is a pro-lobby group that became very powerful in Virginia, of course, right outside of DC, and also began to use Virginia state government funding. And Grant Smith has written an excellent book about this, to promote pro-Israeli policies and businesses at taxpayer expense in Virginia. And the Virginia Advisory Group has exposed a lot of this and works in the Virginia legislature with some success. So they're a really good model. Check out what's being done in Virginia would be one place I would start. But the things I think we really need to hammer home, however this is approached tactically, and it's not really my area of expertise or strength, but the things I think are powerful are, I've already mentioned, but are one, you have to confront people with the fact that they're supporting racism. And they have to be confronted with the fact that, is that what you want? Do you want to support a racist apartheid regime? And do you want your tax funding to go to a tiny nation of 9 million people, which is already by far and away the most powerful country militarily in the Middle East, and one of the most powerful countries in the world, thanks to American tax assistance? I mean, it's absurd that this little country is this militaristic behemoth. Do you want to promote, and it's aggressive on top of it. So the race aspect of this, and the other aspect that I think we really need to bring home is this suppression of free speech. Do you really want to support people who want to take away your right to criticize a foreign country? What happened with Representative Omar, of course, well, was outrageous. I mean, all she did, she made one minor error saying that AIPAC gave money. AIPAC doesn't dole out the money. AIPAC decides who gets it, and then other groups dole it out. Other than that, she was dead on about the Benjamins and got vilified, demonized, called a terrorist, life threats, etc. So do you really want to support these entities which are hostile to freedom of speech? So if you like racial equality, and if you like repression of free speech, you should like Israel in the lobby. I think that's the message we need to get out.
Thank you. Someone is asking if you could comment on newspapers as accurate sources for information on the Middle East and Israel especially.
No, unfortunately, mainstream media is not very good. On Mondoweiss, if you're not familiar with Mondoweiss, it's an excellent site. Philip Weiss and others there, particularly a gentleman named North, they regularly monitor the New York Times and have done a really good job of showing the Times coverage leaves a lot to be desired in terms of Israel. And this radiates out. and I watch CNN, and it's very poor coverage. Again, The Occupation of the American Mind, the film that was mentioned earlier, is really good on this. So no, you do need some sites like Mondoweiss, like Electronic Intifada, like the Middle East, the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs magazine that I write for, which is the best written source for comprehensive Middle East news and information, like Grant Smith's site, like JVP. You have to go to these other places to get informed. You can't rely on American newspapers at all.
Thanks for that. We have time for about 2 more questions. Someone is wondering, someone who has read your book, The Israel Lobby, is wondering if you could speak to the specific role that the Israel Lobby played in the Iraq War, as in Chapter 8.
Well, I don't know how they got it since it's not officially out yet, but good for them. So there have been a few media copies circulating. So Walt and Mearsheimer emphasized this, but it wasn't the sum total of what they emphasized. And what the lobby did was latch onto that and argue that they diminished Walt and Mearsheimer's book by saying, oh, you see, it's just a conspiracy theory that we got into the Iraq war because of the Israel lobby. And that would be too simplistic. What is clear is that the Israel lobby supported the Iraq war. And these invasions of Lebanon as well over history, Israel has long sought and seeks today with respect to Iran to have friendly regimes on its borders. That's what the old Soviet Union used to say, by the way. We just want friendly regimes around us. That's what Israel wants. It wanted to place a Christian regime in Lebanon. That led to those wars that were disastrous. So they wanted to overthrow Saddam Hussein and have a pro-Israeli figure there. So they supported the Iraq war. And they want a war with Iran, many of them today, to get back to those wonderful days when the Shah of Iran was allied with Israel. So Israel, to this extent, like any country, wants friendly regimes on its borders and would support an overthrow. But it wasn't, I don't think, a deep conspiracy in the heart of the American government driven by the Israel lobby. The Iraq war was more a unstable response by a weak, very weak, one of the worst presidents in American history, George W. Bush. If you bring on a needless war that fails and a global recession, you're a pretty bad president, not to mention the non-response to Katrina and some other things, tax cuts for wealthy elites, et cetera. I could go on, but that was more a product of the American almost hysterical reaction to 9/11 than it was. So the Israel lobby was part of it, but it's not simply their impetus that brought on the Iraq war.
Thank you. So I'll just take 2 more questions. Biden has recently reinstated monies to Palestinians, someone has cited. Does this provide any hope, or is Biden hamstrung just as other US presidents have been?
Well, I think he's not only, that's just a moderate civilized move. Trump was beyond the pale in many, many ways, as any intelligent person knows. So restoring basic humanitarian funding, the real question is, will he restore, or will he undo the proclamation and the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem? The answer is no, he won't. And particularly, what will he do on the Iran treaty, which we've already discussed? So Biden is not only hamstrung, he's also basically part of the Washington Insider, pro-Israel, heavily lobbied. He knows all about AIPAC. Believe me, they all know all about AIPAC. And he doesn't want their wrath any more than other politicians do. So I think the Iran treaty is the real critical decision he has to make. And we'll see not just whether he's hamstrung, but how much he himself has bought in and how much courage he has to do the right thing.
Okay, and our final question is kind of a pretty broad and somewhat distressing question, but I think it kind of frames the gravity of the lobby and of the United States' relationship with Israel. Is considering the push to suppress free speech, First Amendment rights, and infiltration of political and cultural organizations and combined with stranglehold on Congress, can we acknowledge that Israel is an existential threat to the United States?
I suppose you could, particularly if it leads to things like war with Iran. But you could also say that the relationship, you might even say the relationship with the reactionary Arab states, because of our addiction to oil, and that's maybe climate change is more of an existential threat. But they're both bad foreign policy. Why don't we just settle for that? It could be an existential threat, and I don't want to downplay that possibility, but it's certainly money very poorly spent for a cause which is brutal and racist oppression. It's wrong in every way, and it's unjust, and it should be changed. And it may even be, yes, an existential threat. So for all these reasons, the Middle East policy of the United States centered on the special relationship and the enabling of Israeli aggression and injustice and apartheid, it needs to be stopped. The sooner the better.
Thank you so much for that insight and for your time with us today. I think I certainly learned some new things, and I hope that the rest of the audience did as well. Janet, do you have any final remarks?